Yarrow kissed me today. Her mouth tasted of fennel. I was watching myself. I was like a bird looking down from the clouds and watching. Maybe I'm becoming a bird. They can see the winds and the cold river too. They fly to the sun. I would like to be a bird, then I could go where the light is. I could help carry the deeds of the dead up into the sky, bit by bit, to be washed in the rain and bleached by the sun and scattered over the earth until they crumble away and are gone forever. Yarrow said, "There's always something to give and something to be taken, Gilly." Then she laughed, close, in my ear. I thought I loved Yarrow as our keeper and my friend. But that kiss is in the world now as an act, as a deed. It was taken from me and maybe I should get it back? But first I have to go and speak to the old man to see if I can persuade him to let Net go. I don't know whether this is a very bad thing or a very good thing that I'm doing. The Sky Machine by Martin Liddermont, performed by Phoebe Lawrence. Season 2, Chapter 2, The Old Man. Well, Mum, I messed up before we even started. They were beating the drums when the sun was still boiling the sea under the world. And the sound seemed to pull the light up over the edge of everything, unrolling it like a blanket. I went up to the platform below the top of the fence and stood leaning on the pointed stakes, and I watched the men approach the village, carrying the hunt and the food from the fields. Each one followed his own path. They stepped across the streams and between the saplings and bushes. I touched all my fingers together, slowly, one by one, and it was that long until they stood outside the wall. Net had woken up and had climbed up to stand beside me, and I pointed and said, "You'll soon be doing that." He shut his eyes and clenched his fists. "What's the matter?" I asked him. He's always been like that when there's a pain inside his head. I don't mean a pain like when you stub your toe on a rock. I mean a pain that comes from a thought. The men were outside the gate, lined up. Hook at the front, Half-Shield and the others in 2 rows behind him. Berry had walked from the gate to meet them, her arms outstretched. The other women were behind her. "Look how strong the men are," I said to Net. "Look at them carrying our food. You'll live with them in their house outside the fence and provide for us and fight for us. You'll keep the village safe and you'll help build the new mound for Hardfist." He sighed, miserably, just as Hook lowered a deer across Berry's arms. Its head flopped down and I could see the blaze of white hair on its throat. Its legs stuck out like brown sticks. "I want to go with you," Net whispered. "I don't want to stay here. I don't want to have the ceremony." I took him by the shoulders and turned him so I could look into his face. "Berry says you must, and she's the tribe's head. Yarrow says you must, and she's our keeper. Hook says you must, and he's a tall man," I said. "There's never been any point shouting at Net, has there, Mum? We knew it when he was born. The quiet baby who never crawled far from the fire. The one who wouldn't run with the other boys and throw sticks at the tethered boar. Who wouldn't hit back when he was pushed around and given the dirty tasks." Net picked at a splinter in the wall. "But Ash didn't say I had to, and she's the server for all the tribes in the valley," he said. I knew then that something big was coming. Like I know when the thunder is going to start rolling round the sky. I can hear the great boulders in the cold river grinding and crashing as it snakes from one side of the world to the other. I hear them before anyone else. "Ash didn't say you had to come with us either," I said. "Anyway, she'll be gone ahead now the sun's up, so there's no arguing it." And I knew that was true. No arguing, especially with Yarrow. Ned could remember making the journey when he was about Daisy's size. He often talked about it, how he had felt and what he had seen and heard. The wonder of it was pulling him to the uplands, and his fear and unhappiness were pushing him out of our village. But I had to be strong for him, because I promised you I would do that, Mum. Berry had turned to the women who were behind her in the gateway. She raised up the deer and sang the morning song. The women lifted their hands and sang with her, and then the men joined in. It was beautiful. I clapped and jumped when they all clapped and jumped below, but Ned put his face in his hands and started crying. I was suddenly angry with him. I'm supposed to be down there with the women, not up on the wall listening to you bawl, I snapped. You'll be a man in a few days' time. Go and do a man's job. Get the water, fill the flasks. We'll need them all. Poor Ned was so startled by my fierce voice that he stopped crying and jumped down the steps. I saw him run into our house first and then fly out of the gates, pushing past the women and the men as they finished their song. They watched him stumble down to the stream, all 6 of our goatskin flasks bumping and jumping round his legs. In his haste, he tried to push them all under the water at the same time and nearly lost 2. His thin arms were submerged up to the elbows in the water, and our old flasks were bobbing around and bubbles were coming up. Some of the men laughed and pointed. Yarrow looked up and saw me on the wall, and I felt my face burn. That afternoon it all came to a head, Mum. Berry and Hook said they had just about had enough of Ned, and he was getting in the way of the preparations for the journey, so they called the village meeting. They lit a fire and even got painted. They put the feathers of the falcon on Berry and the horns of the stag on Hook, and they made poor Ned stand in front of everyone, and he had to ask for permission to get his tattoo. Yarrow was there, and she smiled at him. But it was like watching a wolf grinning. She didn't look like my friend. Then, Berry asked Yarrow what the word was, and she replied, "The boy must kill, and the boy must be held. A day and a night in the arms of the old man." And all the tribe shouted, "Yes!" Ned was white and trembling, but I couldn't do anything. I had to stand and watch. They gave him a man's spear and painted him up too, with the hunting stripes running down his narrow chest until he looked like a wild thing. His eyes were staring out of the red band that went right across his face. Then some of the men trotted off to look for tracks and to prepare the spot for killing, while I took Ned back home and sat him by our fire. I made him some soup, but he wouldn't eat, and his teeth were chattering. Daisy ran up to him and gave him a hug, and he started crying again. "I'm sorry, Mum. I know I shouldn't have done it, but he was so unhappy and I hurt inside." So I got Daisy to run along the passageway between our place and Hemlock's, and then out behind Sling's pottery space to see if his kiln was lit. She came back and said it wasn't, so I got Ned to the end of the passageway. Then I went and had a listen at Sling's place, where he stores the pots, and could hear him snoring in there, and I could smell the brew stink even through the door. So he was drunk again and not lighting his fire that night. I went back and grabbed Ned and pushed him through the little space where the pots go in and told him to stay there and shut up. I told him I was going to tell Berry and Hook that he had run away. Then, when it was dark, we could sneak him out and he would have to get well ahead of us on the route of the journey and then join up with us near the end, so it would be too late for Berry to send him home. I know, it was a mad idea. I didn't know what else to do. I went back to our place and sat by the fire, thinking and thinking, but I don't remember what I thought. Daisy fell asleep. The fire burned down. Then our door opened slowly and Yarrow came in. She looked around. For a moment I thought she was going to speak, but she just came over to me and sat down and put her arms around me. That was enough, Mum. Enough to let it all come out. I cried in her arms for a while and she rocked me. Then she took my face in her hands and turned it to her. She smoothed away the tear trails with her thumbs. And then she kissed me. Later, she said, "There's always something to give and something to be taken, Gilly." Then she laughed, close, in my ear. "Net deserves to become a man, don't you think?" she said. "Why don't you let him? You can't walk the path for him, can you?" "No," I whispered. "I'll look after him, I promise," she said. "I'll make sure the men help him. But he can't hide away, Gilly. He has to go, tonight." "I know," I said. "Gilly, where is he?" she asked. "I hid him in Sling's kiln," I said, starting to cry again. Yarrow smiled and nodded. "Sit here," she said. "Don't interfere, Gilly. He'll be back in the morning before we leave." She hurried out, and I was left in the dark. I heard running feet, but there was no shouting, no sounds of a struggle. I hated myself for not moving, but I couldn't do anything. Then, after a long while, I heard the drums start up and the men howling. I went up onto the fence again, and I could see the fires like sparks stuck to the rocky place on the hillside. I thought about Net, standing with a bloody spear, a boar or an ox lying in a dark pool beside the stake where it had been tied. I imagined Hans holding him down while he got his last man's tattoo cut into his cheek, and Yarrow sang the story of the hunt and the kill. I hoped he was being brave. Eventually the drums stopped, and all but one of the fires went out. I went down and hid close to the gate and waited. It seemed to take forever, but eventually the gate was opened and Yarrow came in. Berry was waiting for her, a thin grey shape in the dark. 2 women with burning torches stood on either side. "It's done," Yarrow said. Berry nodded and took something from Yarrow, something that dripped and steamed in the flickering light. Everyone in the group stared at it. That was my moment, and I slipped from shadow to shadow and was out of the gate and away before their eyes lifted up again. I heard the gate drag shut behind me. Now what was I going to do, Mum? Out in the night, no torch, and no hope of getting Net away from the old man by myself. There was just enough of a moon to see the path up to the rocks, and I made my way, stumbling over rough bits of ground. I had our knife, but it wouldn't save me from a wolf or a bear if they were any nearby. Although people said that the animals always avoided the old man's place after the ceremony. They could see the fire and smell the blood, and they knew. No, I had bought the knife for another reason. I wondered if I would be cursed. But I thought about Net and how frightened he would be, and I kept climbing towards the fire. It was a wavering shape now rather than a spark. I used my hands and feet because the way was steep. I kept pressed hard against the rock face. Little pebbles and hard grains fell, rustling down in the air beside me. They sounded loud, like my breathing. Eventually, the path flattened out. I waited, crouched down, listening. The fire was hidden for a moment here, behind a corner of the hill, and I was just starting to creep towards it to peer round when a dry voice spoke behind me, and I nearly fainted. "You took your time, Gilly," said Serverash. Then she said, "Get up," because I had laid down in the dirt at her feet, stretched out, waiting for my punishment. "You're an idiot, Gilly," she said, pulling me up and brushing me down. "Look at me. Did you think you could just climb up to the old man and walk away with your brother as if you were in the fields picking flowers? What about the guards? What about the bonds?" She grabbed my hand and put something in it. "Take this," she snapped. "Your own knife would have been useless. As for the guards, I sent them home, which is lucky for you and an honour for your brother, because I told them that I would take the watch." She turned towards the path back down the hillside. "There's food enough, and water," she said to me, over her shoulder. "Stick to your plan, Gilly, and keep your mouth closed. And watch out for Yarrow. My plan? How could she know what I had been planning? Why was she helping, and what had she given me? I looked down at it and touched it with my fingertips. A knife, longer than the one in my belt, and sharp and hard and as cold as the coldest stone I'd ever felt. I walked forwards, round the corner, the knife held out in front of me. Net lay in the arms of the old man, his head fallen down on his chest. The old man's face looked out over the valley, his carved eyes staring. The big fire that burned in front of his feet made his expression change. One moment he frowned, then he seemed to be about to speak. Then he smiled. He hugged Net to his wide body with his massive, misshapen hands. Net's wrists and ankles were bound with something that passed through the holes cut in the stone. His feet seemed tiny, standing on a ledge of wood that had been hammered into the old man's navel. Yarrow told me once how our tribe had found the old man heaving himself out of the cliff face. He'd been captive there forever, straining to clamber down and stride through our valley to get a drink of the stream. No one knew where he came from, or what god had turned him into rock. Between the old man and Net in the fire, a slaughtered bear lay, bound to a post. Net's spear was stuck in its side. There was a ragged hole where its heart had been cut out. The matted hair was covered in blood. It was all as I had imagined. Net looked up then, and I saw the tattoo on his face, raw and clear. My little brother. The man. I took a deep breath and walked forwards. The Sky Machine is written by Martin Liddeman and performed by Phoebe Lawrence. Music by Purple Planet Music, Daniel Birch and the Pangolins. Special thanks to Stratford Youth Theatre, which provides high quality drama workshops for children and young people in and around Stratford-upon-Avon. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can listen to the first season at skymachine.podbean.com or search for Sky Machine on any of the major podcast platforms.